In its summer 2010 issue, the Jerusalem Quarterly published an article by Professor Helga Tawil-Souri on Qalandia checkpoint located between Ramallah and Jerusalem. I'm Cléa Thouin, assistant editor for the Journal of Palestine Studies. Here with me today via Skype to talk about her article is Helga Tawil-Souri, assistant professor of culture, media, and communications at New York University. Professor Tawil-Souri, welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Tawil-Souri, in your article, you talk about the fact that the name Qalandia has referred to many places, including a village, a refugee camp, a women's handicraft cooperative, and even a former airport. Why then did you choose to focus on Qalandia checkpoint?
I kind of fell in love with Qalandia from the first moment that I saw it, and I think I became very quickly obsessed with it. But on a more serious note, I think it was obvious from that very first encounter that the checkpoint generally and Qalandia kind of specifically were really sort of the arena where the Palestinian-Israeli conflict kind of takes shape and is very palpable, and also where the conflict and the tensions are sort of constituted on an everyday basis. And so, or to put it another way, I think the checkpoint is where you can see Israeli controls, but also Palestinian resistance to those, and the kind of ongoing dialectic kind of between them. And I think probably more than anything else, I think is sort of indicative of the kind of disordered experience of like geography, space, and time that Palestinians have. And so while there exists a refugee camp and a women's cooperative and the airport on the other side of the wall now, I think today when one says Qalandia, it most often actually evokes the checkpoint.
How would you describe Qalandia checkpoint to someone who's never seen it?
I think the first word that comes to mind is a monstrosity, probably followed by a number of adjectives that aren't actually physically descriptive, like oppressive, scary, sad, absurd, disruptive. But I think to describe it physically also depends on what time frame we're actually talking about, because Qalandia has been a very kind of dynamic place, as all checkpoints have been. And I mean that both in the location where one actually meets the Israeli soldiers, but also the space around it. So that in the early 2000s, when it first emerged, it was really sort of this roadblock that was loud, dusty, muddy, chaotic, kind of very bustling and dynamic, where it was really just a sort of place that separated the flow of traffic from Ramallah and Ram and Jerusalem. And then around it kind of emerged these taxi stands and bus stops, and then increasing numbers of merchants. But then over the years, it kind of became very fortified, so that today, the concrete blocks and the plastic barricades and the wired fences have given way to this building, this very permanent terminal that is kind of a de facto border. So there's a building, there's surveillance cameras, there's sort of very orderly queues that separate men and women and Palestinians and foreigners. There's stricter rules of movement, and the outside has also changed in the sense that there's a clearer separation between pedestrians and vehicles. There's the wall, there's a parking lot, there's all kinds of things that didn't really exist before. And then also the kind of now slow disappearance of the merchants that used to be there 5 or almost 10 years ago.
And do all checkpoints look like Qalandia?
Israel now calls Qalandia a terminal, not a checkpoint, which is a bit of a misleading or a misguiding label that somehow suggests that this sort of official border crossing, giving it a kind of aura of legitimacy, which it isn't, because Qalandia, like most checkpoints, is actually inside of Palestinian areas. So increasingly, these kinds of terminals like Qalandia do look the same in a way. They're made up of the same kinds of materials, of these sort of concrete walls, of roofs, of surveillance cameras, of automated turnstiles, fluorescent lights, multilingual signs, and so on. And even the space around them, to a certain extent, is made to look the same. Like the land is often flattened. There's the wall that often juts nearby. There's the Israeli flag fluttering in the wind, and so on. But I think Qalandia and every checkpoint is also very unique. And this uniqueness is not what is created by the Israeli regime, by the Palestinians themselves. So the merchants are different. In some checkpoints you don't have any, in other checkpoints you do. The graffiti is also the sort of like unique and ever-changing kind of aspect of checkpoints. So checkpoints really, I think, are more of a kind of lived space that is transformed day to day by the people who use it.
What are some of the official and unofficial purposes of Israeli checkpoints in the occupied territories?
The official reason for checkpoints was originally to stop terrorist attacks inside of Israel, although checkpoints actually emerged mostly before terror attacks in Israel actually began. So despite the official rhetoric, I think checkpoints are really part of the ongoing Israeli colonial process to kill Palestinian space. And what I mean by that is both the physical land, also the lived space of Palestinians. So that checkpoints are really part of a larger matrix of control, of Israeli control over Palestinian life, of the fragmentation of Palestinian land and space. So along with settlements, with the wall, with bypass roads, policies of closure, the regimes of differentiated ID cards and permits and so on, checkpoints kind of serve to segregate and fragment Palestinians from each other, from Israel, often also from the outside world, and kind of limit Palestinian mobility. And so checkpoints are really kind of like the physical barricades that really imprison Palestinians and that asphyxiate and shrink the geographic, the economic, the political, and the symbolic spaces of Palestine.
You explained in your article that Palestinians have, to some extent, co-opted these checkpoints as social and economic centers. How exactly do Palestinians use these checkpoints?
I think what's most interesting about checkpoints is what actually happens in the space around them, not so much in the interaction with the soldiers. So that over the years, for example, Qalandia and many other checkpoints as well, these adjacent spaces have been turned into transportation centers. So, hubs for taxi drivers and bus drivers and so on, but also bazaars, shopping centers, almost kind of shopping centers or shopping areas, meeting points or kind of rendezvous places, right? So that they're really kind of economic and social hubs. And each is unique with its own rhythm, with its own sets of people that are there kind of day in and day out that kind of make it their place of work. And so most obvious has been the sort of emergence of the transportation sector, if you will, like the taxi drivers and the bus drivers and so on, but also a range of other kinds of merchants, from the pushcart owners to the merchants who first emerged to sell coffee or ice cream to people who were waiting, and then later, books, clothes, underwear, cell phones, everything that you can kind of imagine. So there is that sort of economic aspect of how they've been transformed into these centers, right? I think it also should be said that checkpoints have also been often sort of places for protest, where, for example, in the early years of Qalandia, it used to be the place where you would kind of confront the Israeli regime in the flesh, so that you'd have usually kind of young boys kind of go there to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers. Today, that's sort of not so much the case. But instead, you can kind of think of the concrete of Qalandia and the wall around it as the sort of canvas for artists, whether Palestinian or otherwise, kind of marking it in a unique space for themselves in a way.
You mentioned in your article that Palestinians sometimes jokingly refer to Qalandia checkpoint as a duty-free zone. Can you discuss some of the parallels between airports and checkpoints?
So the duty-free zone was really sort of in reference to this kind of massive merchandise that used to be available around the checkpoints. But I think that thinking about airports and checkpoints in parallel is much more beyond sort of duty-free. Airports are places of coming and going. They're centers for transportation for both people and for goods. And one spends time at an airport, hopefully, to get somewhere else. So you don't kind of live at an airport. You don't stay at an airport all day, hopefully. But while you're at the airport, you're in this kind of static bubble. And it looks and feels pretty much the same as any other kind of airport. So there are obviously differences between, say, Heathrow and Charles de Gaulle and JFK, but functionally and often visually, they're sort of the same as well. So in an airport, you're surrounded by surveillance cameras, by queues, by special waiting areas. While you're there, you can shop, you can browse at storefronts, you can observe other travelers, you're bored, you're waiting, you eat, you have your cup of coffee, whatever it is. You're also kind of you are separated from the surrounding environment. So you're in this kind of anonymous zone that is not part of the outside world. And nobody lives at an airport, even though it's kind of bustling with people, with travelers and the people who work there. Often those people are kind of visible. Like if you think of an airport, you think of, say, the baggage handlers or the control tower engineers. So there is a sense of transience at an airport in that you're not supposed to be there for very long, and you're only there in order to get somewhere else. So that it's a kind of space in between. It's neither here nor there. And then there's this further kind of anonymity at an airport in that you're alone, you're separated from the outside, you wait. You could very well be very anxious about your trip and kind of nervous about what's about to happen. But at some point, everybody's going to have to hand over their identity documents to an officer of some kind. So it's also a place of authority. And so I think checkpoints kind of share a lot with airports in those kinds of ways. There's this huge body of people, none of whom are kind of permanently there. It's this kind of anonymous place of cameras, of waiting, of queues, and so on. You can also shop and browse and so on. And then it's also a place where you don't interact with the outside world, or rather where your interaction with others is very specific. So either you have the kind of very bureaucratic, and in the case of checkpoints, oppressive transaction with the soldier, or this sort of seller-buyer relationship if you're buying yourself a cup of coffee, for example, right? So checkpoints are kind of like airports in the sense that they are kind of gathering and dispersal sites. They're a pit stop on the way to someplace else. And so they're gateways, or sort of like these immobile, static spaces for the function of kind of ongoing mobility. But I think also my point is that they're unlike airports in that they are actually barriers, not just gateways. So that, checkpoints are sort of both an opening and a closing, or a hub and an end, unlike airports, because they really kind of serve to sever and hinder and limit Palestinian mobility.
In your article, you talk about the concept of non-space. What does this mean, and how does it relate to Israeli checkpoints?
Well, Marc Auger, the French anthropologist, described airports, hotel rooms, supermarkets, and a range of other kind of places as non-places, in that they don't really have an inherent character, because their function is really just as a sort of transition, or they really just provide transition from one place to another. And so they are the sort of space of in-betweenness, as I've sort of just recently described about checkpoints. So there's a sort of transient space made up of people who are not permanently there. And so this interstitial transient space that is removed from its surrounding environment, where there is nothing of permanency, really, I think the checkpoint can obviously be thought of that, but also as a metaphor for Palestine itself, I think, so that the whole Palestinian nation, and very broadly, those in the territories, in Israel, in the refugee camps, in exile, and across the diaspora, have been defined by a very unequal and problematic relationship with mobility and immobility that is largely determined by somebody else. And so as a Palestinian, your place is insecure, your experience of time is disorganized and not yours to manage. You don't have control over your land. Your freedom is deceptive. You're separated and segregated from each other. Your identity is constantly being checked and is sort of treated suspiciously from the onset. Your borders are furtive and seem to sort of multiply, and you're neither here nor there. Now, I've just described, I think, a checkpoint, but I think I've also just described Palestinian space.
Professor Tawil-Souri, thank you very much for talking to Palestine Studies TV.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.